The vast, unbroken expanse of the high plains, stretching from the Texas Panhandle up to the Dakotas, felt like the final frontier of American opportunity. In the early 1920s, a fever gripped the Midwest, a wheat fever. Following the demands of World War I, which had consumed European grain supplies, American farmers were encouraged, even implored, to increase production. The government and powerful land speculators painted a picture of infinite bounty. Clear the native buffalo grass, plant the deep-rooted winter wheat, and the riches would follow. This was not just farming, it was a national calling, fueled by a powerful yet ultimately misplaced optimism that the good times and the rains would last forever. My grandfather, Silas, bought into this dream, using every dollar he had to purchase 320 acres in western Kansas. He named his farm Promise Acre, believing the earth held an endless reserve of fertility. The slogan of the age was simple: rain follows the plow. It was a myth rooted in wishful thinking, suggesting that turning the soil somehow encouraged precipitation. The tractors, new and powerful, made the job easy. They cut through the dense millennia-old sod, a natural carpet that had protected the delicate topsoil through countless droughts. This sod was the land's armor, but Silas and thousands of others saw it only as an obstacle to be vanquished. They tore it out, layer by layer, until the plains were a monotonous ocean of brown, ready for the golden harvest. For a few years, the promise held. The skies delivered just enough moisture. Harvests were miraculous, and the price of grain, though volatile, brought enough money for a new Ford pickup and a little extra for Ma's dress fund. The air was crisp, the sun was bright, and the future seemed assured. Neighbors gathered for barn dances, their laughter echoing across fields that were for the first time in history completely exposed. They talked of progress and abundance, never once considering that the cycle of wet years they were enjoying was an aberration, not the norm for this semi-arid region. The problem, though unseen, was structural. The deep plowing methods practiced by Silas and his peers completely pulverized the soil. Unlike the buffalo grass, which held the earth together with its intricate root system, the shallow roots of the annual wheat offered poor defense against the inevitable dry spells. When the rains began to fail in 1930, the exposed earth, now turned to a fine flour-like powder, had nothing to anchor it. The first dust storms were viewed as anomalies, temporary irritations. But as 1931 gave way to 1932 and the dry pattern became entrenched, the wind began its merciless work. The optimism that had powered the great plow-up started to curdle into doubt. Silas would walk his fields, now barren and cracked, the fine dust rising around his boots with every step. He would stare at the horizon, a knot forming in his stomach. Where the land once offered plenty, it now offered nothing but dry, powdery punishment. The plows had not brought rain, they had simply prepared the stage for the coming catastrophe. The boundless wheat fields, once a symbol of the American spirit, were transforming into a terrifying landscape of dust and despair, a direct consequence of man's belief that he could dominate nature without consequence. The great experiment in overcultivation was about to exact a terrible price. The good times were over. The dust was coming. April 14th, 1935 began like any other oppressive Sunday in the Panhandle. The air was unnaturally warm and still, heavy with a sense of foreboding that settled over the sun-baked farms like a shroud. For months, the dust had been a perpetual nuisance, a daily battle fought with damp cloths, sealing tape, and stoicism. But these had been snusters, manageable irritations. The events of that day, forever etched into the collective memory as Black Sunday, would redefine the struggle, proving to the most stubborn settlers that they were no longer simply enduring a bad patch of weather. They were caught in a profound environmental apocalypse. Alara May, Silas's wife, was preparing a meager Sunday dinner of potatoes and salt pork, trying to ignore the constant, gritty taste in her mouth. Silas was outside tinkering with the rusty windmill, convinced a stronger pump could somehow conjure water from the failing aquifer. Their daughter, Lily, was reading her tattered copy of Little Woman on the porch, seeking refuge from the suffocating house. The silence was the first sign. All the small, familiar noises of the farm, the distant whine of a dog, the rustle of dry weeds, vanished. The world held its breath. Around 3 p.m., a neighbor, Mr. Harrison, drove past the farm, his truck's horn blaring frantically. He was shouting something incomprehensible about a wall. Silas rushed inside, his face pale beneath the layers of dust he habitually wore. "It's coming, Alara," he choked out. Wholesale removal of the moisture-retaining topsoil, the shallow wells of the region began to gasp, then cough, and finally fall silent. Silas remembered the morning the well first failed. It wasn't a dramatic event. He lowered the bucket as usual, the rope scraping against the stone sides. Instead of the satisfying splash that signaled a successful draw, he heard only a muffled thunk, the bucket hitting dry, cracked mud. He pulled it up, his hands trembling. The bottom was lined with a powdery silt, not the clear water he desperately needed. He lowered it again, pulling up nothing but the ghost of moisture. A deep, chilling panic, far colder than the dry wind that whipped around him, began to set in. Without water, they were doomed. The dust storms had ruined the crops and suffocated the livestock, but the silence of the well meant the end of all existence on Promise Acre. It was a panic that burrowed deep into the roots of his soul, far beyond the surface anxiety caused by the mortgages and the grit. Alara May was forced to stretch their dwindling reserves to impossible lengths. Drinking water was rationed to a few precious cups a day. Washing clothes became a forgotten luxury, and washing oneself was reduced to a quick, dusty wipe-down. The small garden she had nursed with such care, her last connection to a fertile past, withered and died, its dried stems brittle and gray, mocking her efforts. The few chickens they had left staggered weakly, their combs drooping. Silas spent 2 grueling days digging the well deeper with a shovel and pickaxe, the only tools he had. He worked in a pit of his own making, breathing the recirculated dust, his muscles screaming, driven by the knowledge that his family's survival rested on hitting moisture. He finally struck a layer of hard pan rock, utterly dry, and dropped his pickaxe in defeat. The silence of the metal striking stone echoed the hollow silence of the land itself. The silence of the wells was the moment the dream truly died. The settlers could fight the dust, they could starve, they could even fight the creditors, but they could not fight the absence of water. When the well failed, it revealed the terrible truth: the land had rejected them. It was a betrayal rooted in their own hubris. Silas walked back to the house, his shoulders slumped not just from fatigue, but from the crushing weight of realization. He was a farmer who could no longer farm, a provider who could no longer provide. The deep-rooted panic, now fully matured, left only one viable path: flight. The decision to leave Promise Acre, once an unthinkable surrender, was now a harsh necessity whispered by the empty, silent well. The overwhelming dust storms, the so-called black blizzards, were terrifying spectacles that lasted hours, but the true misery of the Dust Bowl was not the storms themselves, it was the relentless, pervasive residue they left behind. Life was reduced to an endless, losing battle against a fine powder on everything, a suffocating reality that turned every breath, every meal, and every moment of rest into a desperate, gritty ordeal. Inside the small, drafty farmhouse on Promise Acre, the dust was not a visitor, it was a permanent occupant. It seeped through the walls, cascaded down the chimney, and filtered through the very weave of the cloth used to cover the windows. It was finer than flour, sharper than sand, and had the corrosive tenacity of rust. No matter how diligently Alara May swept, scrubbed, or sealed, within hours a new film of light brown powder settled silently over every surface, mocking her effort. Silas and Alara May woke up each morning with the taste of earth in their mouths and a dry rasp in their throats. Their bedding, despite being covered with newspapers and blankets, felt like sandpaper. When Silas coughed, he often spat up dark, mucousy pellets, the literal earth packing itself into his lungs. This was the dreaded dust pneumonia, a crippling illness that stalked the young and the elderly, claiming victims not with a sudden blow, but with slow, airless suffocation. The simple act of eating became a hazardous ritual. Alara May would place food on the table only seconds before they ate it, hoping to limit contamination. She developed a technique for serving bread, slicing it quickly, swiping the newly exposed surface with it.
Perpetually twilight world, the sunlight muted to a sickly yellow-brown by the damp, dust-caked cloth. The sheets required constant re-wetting, a frustrating drain on the household's dwindling water supply, but it was a non-negotiable task. Without the damp filter, the fine grit would quickly render the house uninhabitable. Mealtime was the most choreographed act of defense. The few remaining pots and pans were kept inverted, often wrapped in cloth, and only exposed for the absolute minimum time required for cooking. Alara May would cook simple stews or boiled potatoes under the heavy lid of a pressure cooker, minimizing the time the food was exposed to the dusty air. When serving, the family sat pressed tightly together around a small table covered with a freshly wrung, damp towel. They ate quickly, heads bowed low over their tin plates, trying not to stir up any air currents. If a storm was approaching, they sometimes ate in the absolute dark, preferring the certainty of blindness to the risk of breathing in a mouthful of dust with their meager dinner. This existence was a constant, exhausting struggle against an invisible enemy. The kerosene-soaked rags and the damp, perpetually gritty sheets were symbols of their tenacity and their poverty. They highlighted the terrifying contrast between the natural disaster outside and the desperate artificial environment they were forced to maintain inside. Every morning, the kerosene scent and the damp cloth were the first things they noticed, a bitter reminder that they were not living, but merely surviving under siege, praying that these desperate measures would keep the grit out of their lungs for just one more day. For the children of the Dust Bowl, the one-room schoolhouse was meant to be a refuge, a place of learning, warmth, and normalcy. Yet, as the disaster deepened, the school became merely another extension of the gritty, struggling world outside. Schoolhouse in the Storm became a harsh reality, where textbooks competed with the roar of the wind, and lessons in arithmetic were overshadowed by practical education and despair and survival. Lily, Silas and Alara May's daughter, was 10 years old and attended the Red Rock School, a dilapidated wooden building 3 miles down the road. During the brief periods of clear weather, the walk was a relief, a small slice of freedom. But once the dust began to fly, her journey became hazardous. Her mother would send her out wrapped in a kerchief soaked in camphor oil, her face covered by a damp rag, resembling a tiny, frightened ghost. Sometimes the dust storms would materialize so quickly that visibility dropped to 0 within minutes. On those days, the children would fumble blindly, sometimes linking arms to ensure they didn't wander off the road and become lost in the choking fog of soil. Life inside the school was hardly better. Miss Peterson, the weary teacher who taught all 8 grades in one room, did her best. She would stuff rags into the window frames and use masking tape to seal the cracks, but the dust always found a way. By mid-morning, a layer of fine brown silt coated the desks, the chalkboard, and the students' heads. The children learned to write their multiplication tables not just on paper, but by tracing numbers into the dust film on their desks. During a full-blown black blizzard, lessons were often entirely suspended. The roar of the wind was so loud it drowned out Miss Peterson's voice, and the room became so dark that she was forced to light a kerosene lamp. The children would gather in the center of the room, far from the rattling, potentially shattering windows, pulling their coat collars up over their noses. They learned to remain absolutely silent, listening to the house creak and groan under the immense pressure of the earth outside. The moment Mr. Harrison drove away, leaving behind a plume of fine dust, Silas felt a cold, empty terror. It wasn't just the loss of the physical property, it was the loss of his identity as a landowner and provider. It was the crushing realization that in the face of natural and economic disaster, no amount of hard work offered protection. The land was ruined, the economy was broken, and now their home was stolen by the system they had trusted. Nothing was safe. The bank notice was a final, undeniable sign that their fight against the dust was officially over, and they had lost everything. They were now truly dispossessed, forced onto the dusty road with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a terrifying uncertainty ahead. After the crushing reality of foreclosure, the day-to-day existence of the families left behind became an acute lesson in scarcity. With the fields barren, the livestock sold off for pennies, and cash non-existent, survival hinged entirely upon ingenuity and the ability to turn virtually nothing into sustenance. Making do with nothing was not a choice, it was the culinary rule of the Dust Bowl, where every meal was a testament to human resourcefulness and sheer desperation. Alara May, once a proud cook known for her bountiful pantry, now faced the daily challenge of feeding Silas and Lily from an almost empty cupboard. Her supplies were reduced to the absolute bare minimum: a sack of coarse cornmeal, a few jars of dusty, home-canned vegetables from years past, and whatever meager relief supplies the local government or charity organizations managed to distribute. The cornerstone of their diet was the Dust Bowl pie. It wasn't a pie at all, but a thick, dry tortilla made from mixing cornmeal with water, sometimes adding a pinch of lard if they were lucky, and baking it on a flat stone over an open fire. It was tasteless, gritty, and hard to swallow, but it provided calories. Another staple was water gravy, made by boiling water, thickening it slightly with flour, and flavoring it with salt, pepper, and perhaps a drop of vinegar to mimic flavor. It was eaten over stale bread or sometimes over nothing at all. One day, Silas managed to trade a rusted shovel for a small bag of dried beans. Alara May turned this treasure into Hoover stew, named cynically over the president many blamed for the Depression. This stew was a watery broth of beans, scavenged wild onions, and any scrap of fat or bone she could find. It had to be cooked for hours over a slow, guarded fire, constantly covered to prevent the ever-present fine dust from settling into the pot. The most prized and most scrutinized ingredient was the occasional meager resource provided by federal programs. Relief trucks sometimes brought government surplus staples, bags of dried beans, occasionally powdered milk, and, most importantly, peanut butter. The peanut butter was treated like gold. A spoonful was enough to transform a bland cornmeal cake into a festive meal. Alara May would mix the peanut butter with a little water to stretch it into a thin sauce, pouring it carefully over their boiled potatoes. Mealtime was a silent, ritualistic affair. They ate quickly, heads bent low, conserving energy and minimizing exposure to dust. There was no conversation, only the scrape of forks on tin plates. Alara May had to be fiercely vigilant against waste food. Even a crumb was considered a lost opportunity. Lily, too young to fully understand the crisis, often asked for seconds. Alara May would gently rub her back and say, "That's all the luck we had today, honey. Tomorrow, perhaps we'll find another onion." The challenge was not just about filling their stomachs, but providing nutrients and variety. Alara May constantly searched the dry creek beds for edible weeds or scraps. This enforced simplicity and reliance on resourceful meals ingrained a deep, lasting respect for every single calorie. Making do with nothing became a powerful lesson in human tenacity. The journey along Route 66 was supposed to be the passage to a better life, but for Silas, Alara May, and Lily, it swiftly became a brutal education in American class hatred and prejudice. As they traveled west, they shed their identities as proud farmers and were recast cruelly as Okies and the stigma, a derogatory label applied indiscriminately to all migrants fleeing the Dust Bowl, regardless of whether they came from Oklahoma, Texas, or Kansas. This new identity brought with it immediate and intense hostility. The sight of their heavily laden Model T, dusty, rattling, and clearly carrying the desperation of the plains, drew immediate scorn. As they passed through towns in New Mexico and Arizona, the reactions ranged from icy stares to outright aggression. Local residents saw the influx of thousands of impoverished, ragged families not as fellow Americans in crisis, but as an invading force, a burden on their already strained communities, and an unwelcome competition for meager jobs. One evening in a small Arizona town, Silas pulled the rattler into a rundown auto camp.
He approached the owner, a man with a suspicious glare, to ask about a pitch for the night. The man didn't even let him finish his sentence. "Ain't got no room for your kind," the owner snapped, pointing to a crudely painted sign nailed to a post. "No Okies allowed." "We're Kansans, sir," Silas corrected, trying to maintain his dignity. "And we just need a few hours' rest." The man spat on the ground near Silas's boots. "You're dust trash. You bring disease and ruin. Get that rust bucket off my property before I call the sheriff." Silas felt the humiliation burn in his throat. He had always been a man respected in his community. Now he was reduced to dust trash, categorized and rejected purely based on his poverty and his origin. The stigma followed them everywhere. At grocery stores, prices for bread and milk were often raised prohibitively high when it was clear the buyer was a migrant. In filling stations, they were often refused service, forcing Silas to drain the radiator water just to keep the engine from overheating. Lily, sensitive and observant, picked up on the cruelty. Other children pointed and whispered. When they stopped at a river to wash clothes, a group of local youths threw stones at them until they fled, leaving their wet laundry behind. This constant discrimination created a devastating psychological burden. It taught them that their suffering was not met with sympathy, but contempt. It forced the migrants to band together for safety and support, recognizing that the only kindness they would find would be from others who shared the road and the slur. They had left the literal storm only to enter a social storm, where the hatred of their fellow men was as blinding and painful as any dust blizzard. The label Okie stripped away their identity, reducing their struggle to a stereotype of filth and destitution. Silas realized that the greatest challenge in California would not just be finding work, but fighting the invisible barrier of prejudice that had been erected against them long before they even crossed the state line. They arrived in the Golden State battered, not just by the journey, but by the shattering realization that in America, even basic human dignity was a privilege denied to those who had lost everything. Upon arriving in California, the promised land turned out to be a cruel mirage. The migrants, dispossessed and labeled as Okies, found no welcoming arms or ready jobs. Instead, they encountered a hostile environment and competition so fierce that only the barest margin of survival was possible. This reality gave rise to the tragic makeshift camps known as Hoovervilles, temporary, desperate settlements that became the enduring. Silas's first job was picking peaches in a vast orchard near Fresno. The work was immediate and brutal. He, Alara Mae, and even Lily were required to work from sunup until sunset, climbing tall, rickety ladders and wrestling heavy baskets of fruit. The California sun was unforgiving, beating down on their unprotected skin, and the air, though cleaner than the Dust Bowl, was thick with the scent of overripe fruit and sweat. The landowners, keenly aware that thousands of desperate families were lining up for every available job, practiced severe exploited wages. They paid by the bushel, not by the hour, a system designed to keep the migrants constantly striving and earning barely enough to survive. Silas might spend 10 hours picking and earn just 75 cents, enough for a small tin of beans and some kerosene. If the fruit was thin on the branch or the landowner suspected poor quality, the entire day's tally could be slashed or, worse, rejected outright. The constant hunt for work was the deepest source of anxiety. The work was seasonal, meaning the family had to pack up every few weeks and follow the ripening crops: peaches in summer, grapes in early fall, then cotton or walnuts. They lived out of the Rattler, driving hundreds of miles between jobs, often arriving at a new town only to find that word of the harvest had spread too quickly and hundreds of families had already filled the job quota. Silas spent countless hours waiting by the side of the road with dozens of other men, his hack clutched in his hands, hoping a foreman would point his way. Alara Mae, despite her fatigue, worried constantly about Lily. The girl worked alongside them, her small hands becoming calloused and scratched. She was supposed to be in school, but survival trumped education. The work camps they lived in were often worse than the Hoovervilles, primitive shacks or crowded tents with no running water and little sanitation, kept deliberately poor and temporary by the owners to discourage any sense of permanence or entitlement.
One evening, after Silas was shorted 20 cents on his pay by a dismissive foreman, he finally broke. He threw his dusty hat on the ground, his body shaking with a mix of exhaustion and impotent rage. "They treat us worse than animals, Alara," he choked out. "We are honest people. We work until our backs break, and they steal from us." Alara May, rubbing his shoulders, spoke with a quiet resolve born of long suffering. "They need the work done, Silas, and we need to eat. We are fruit tramps, honey. We keep moving and we keep working. That's how we stay alive." The life of the fruit tramp was a stark lesson in the dark side of the American dream, a brutal hierarchy where the dispossessed were exploited mercilessly. But it also forged a steely resilience. They learned how to maximize every cent, how to patch their tires with rubber and hope, and how to find solidarity with other families in the fields, the shared community of those who had lost their homes but not their will to survive. The harsh reality of California's farm camps and the relentless exploitation by landowners left the Dust Bowl migrants feeling utterly isolated and defeated. Yet, in the shared experience of extreme suffering, a profound and necessary bond was forged. This powerful connection, a collective spirit of resistance and mutual support, was the Grapes of Wrath echo, illustrating how the dispossessed found community and solidarity as their only true defense against a brutal world. Silas, Alarme, and Lily found temporary sanctuary in a government-run camp, a brief, organized respite from the squalor of the private ranch shacks. Unlike the Hoovervilles, these camps, often federally supervised, offered running water, sanitation, and a small democratic committee run by the residents themselves. It was here that the sense of solidarity truly blossomed. The camp was filled with hundreds of families who had all driven the same dusty roads and heard the same cruel slurs. They were all Okies.
The core of the new philosophy was conservation. Farmers were paid small stipends, a crucial incentive in the Depression, to implement new techniques. Contour plowing, tilling the land along the natural curves of the hills rather than in straight rows, creating small ditches to trap water and slow runoff. Strip cropping, alternating rows of cash crops like wheat with rows of cover crops like sorghum to provide windbreaks and ground cover. Shelter belts. The most visible change was the planting of trees. Millions of native trees were planted in vast perpendicular rows across the plains to act as enormous windbreaks, breaking the force of the devastating winds before they could lift the topsoil. Initially, many farmers were skeptical. These methods were slower and required different equipment, but when a neighbor who refused to participate lost his entire field in a single afternoon dust storm while the contoured field next door remained stable, the practical lessons became undeniable. The federal payments provided the necessary means for the farmers to survive while their land recovered. The process of healing the land was agonizingly slow. The soil was so depleted of nutrients and organic matter that it took years for the new cover crops to establish a strong root system. The trees, newly planted saplings, needed constant tending to survive the dry conditions. It was a test of patience, requiring farmers to abandon the aggressive, get-rich-quick mindset for a long-term commitment to sustainability. The result was not just ecological change, but a profound cultural shift. The SCS taught farmers to respect the fragile environment of the plains, recognizing that nature demanded cooperation, not domination. The conservation seed, once planted, slowly took root, eventually transforming the once ruined landscape. Though the scars of the Dust Bowl would remain, the new practices, born out of desperate necessity and government aid, laid the foundation for modern, sustainable agriculture, ensuring that the disaster of the 1930s would never be repeated on the same catastrophic scale. Decades passed after the Great Migrations. The children who had choked on the fine powder and suffered the shame of the Hoovervilles grew into adults, forever marked by the crucible of the 1930s. The ordeal of Silas, Alara May, and Lily did not end with the last storm or the final harvest. It was woven into the fabric of their character, forming the core of the Dust Bowl legacy, a generation profoundly defined by resilience and a renewed respect for nature's power. Lily, now a grandmother living in California, still carried the memory of the dust in a way her children could never truly grasp. She was fiercely frugal, a trait ingrained by years of starvation. She never wasted a crumb of food, always saved string and paper, and could fix almost